a fabulous panel, which I've been really, really looking forward to, which I'll talk about in a sec. And then the last session of the day will be celebrating the second of our MeasureUp award winners. So we'll have Jane Waterhouse from Our Media talking about the Defiant research, which all our agency people voted as the most important piece of media owner research in the sort of cultural and audience space. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Jane on that. But now we have a panel that's not short of opinions, looking at what the role of brands is in social and societal change. There's been a lot of discussion in market, I guess over the last couple of years in particular, with a lot of disruption in a lot of different issues and discussion what the role of a brand is there, both from a moral point of view, from a brand alignment point of view, and increasingly looking at, I guess, the economic side of things, whether it's good or bad. You have a fabulous guide to take you through this, the wonderful Megan Brownlow, who should be a stranger to no one, one of our leading media and advertising consultants in the market, is going to keep this conversation going, keep everyone on track, and hopefully flourish out some brilliant ideas you can take away. Megan, I'll hand it over to you to introduce your panel.
Thank you, Gay. This is a really good panel. I'm so excited, and thanks to the IAB for pulling together some really good minds. So Sophie Finn from Allianz, who's got a long history of a marketer who gets this space. She really walks the talk. Geeta from the UTS Business School, one of the best business schools in the country. I really am looking forward to hearing what Geeta brings that academic lens. And Howard Parry husband, also from academic lens, but a research background from Pollinate. So, and Leah, we have Leah who is not there. Leah, you there?
Yes, I am. Can you?
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Great. So we have this brilliant Leah Robinson for Agency World. We have such a good panel. We're going to kick off with this discussion on social commerce, which has been a factor for marketers for quite some years now, which shows that marketers understand there's a payoff if they get it right. However, we probably don't need to prosecute the case that it's a positive thing, but there are so many pitfalls and landmines. So I think it might be more useful for our audience if we start there. So what are those pitfalls and landmines, and how can they be avoided? Let's go to you, Sophie.
I think the pitfalls and landmines, for me, very much when you have a disconnect between what your brand actually stands for and is about, and the corporate strategy, and what might then become a marketing ploy. So when you look at social causes, or when you look at propositions that you want to expand beyond your core competencies, you need to really look at adjacencies. And what I mean by that is you don't want to go out and, sort of stand for one thing, or your industry reflect one thing. It's got to make sense in the eyes of the consumer.
Yeah. Geeta, what do you think? Feel free to use some examples too.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sophie completely. I think that brands need to do more than just pay lip service to an issue. If they're, they say they're supporting it. We've seen examples. I mean, just this year, we've seen this whole revival of Black Lives Matter. And I think there's an Australian fashion brand, Zimmerman, which pledged support to the brand online, but then they came, I think there was a document that got leaked by a couple of the interns who said that they had internal policies which didn't align with, freedom of expression. So they had rules around how women or how employees should, maintain their appearance or their hair and things like that. So I think that that's a good example of a brand which, online says that they're, committed to an issue, but then within the company internally, it doesn't really align.
Yeah, not walking the talk, hey? Howard, what do you think? How can the pitfalls and landmines be avoided?
I think Geeta has nailed it there with more than just lip service, exactly to Sophie's point about the difference between a corporate strategy and the need to make money, which is the only obligation corporates really have, versus the brand, which is really about aligning with society's values. And increasingly we're seeing those changing values, whether it's Black Lives Matter or gay marriage or whatever it might be. The question I'm often asked, because ultimately I'm a researcher, is well, how do we actually do this? And I think that the risk is that there's a difference between perception of change, I'm a brand, look what I'm doing, and actually the change in perception. And I think, sorry, the first one should have been change in perception. Look at me, what I'm doing. Okay, the perception of change is, are you actually doing it? And actually businesses are really much happy to make ads saying how good they are and align with stuff and forge partnerships and stick logos on, whether it's fair trade or whatever, than they actually are to look at their supply chains and go, oh, maybe we employ slave labor. Actually, maybe we've got a whole load of people who are actually arrogant, misogynistic, or whatever it might be. So I think the key here is actually integrating your vision, your brand vision and strategy, and turning it inside and going, are we actually walking the talk? And I would suggest that's where we need to be bold and brave and call it out. Just call it out. I'm sorry, that's not acceptable. We actually don't do that. Exactly to Geeta's point. If you are within an organization, then I think it's quite fine to say to your boss, I think we're being hypocritical, sanctimonious, and frankly, we deserve to lose. We'll come to it later, but I think the biggest opportunity is risk. If the brand, the communications, side of it, the hope, the opportunity, the other side of it within companies is to go, we will lose money, we will lose share, we will lose reputation if we don't actually change our practices and get our own house in order.
Hold that thought, because we will come to it later. It's really important. Leah from Spark Foundry, what do you think?
I agree with everyone. A brand needs to be authentically aligned with a cause. And if you're not, if what you're doing and if your message doesn't align with your business practices, all of a sudden you're inauthentic and customers will point that out.
Yeah.
I think a really nice example of that was the cost. So in 2019, they released a range of polo shirts with endangered species featured on the product as opposed to the traditional crocodile. But at the same time, they had products on their website like deer leather gloves and cow leather handbags. So obviously there's an inconsistency there, and customers were pretty quick to point that out.
What a great example. So Sophie, you're a brand marketer and your influence on Allianz is showing. How can you share with us the Allianz approach?
Sure. I think it's worth saying, and we spoke about this, Megan, at the beginning, was when we actually first met, was I actually choose my jobs based on the influence and the company and the broader activities that they do. And because I actually believe very strongly that brands can drive societal change and have an onus of responsibility to drive societal change, but very pragmatically. So it's not change for the sake of change or change that doesn't have commercial benefit, because I think the two have to come together. So for me, I actually was consulting to Allianz, and I heard Oliver Bater, who was our global CEO, speak at a town hall in February in Sydney. And it was one of those life-changing moments where just the world stood still, and I went, actually, I'm not going to swear, but I just went, wow, this guy gets it. This is the most inspirational CEO I have ever heard speak. And I decided then and there, I was going to stay and work for this company because I believed in what he was saying. And what he talked about was the purpose of Allianz, which is we secure your future. Now, sounds quite dry, but don't forget it's got to go across 70 countries and many different languages. But it's actually based on the idea that we help shape and change, and we're there for customers, but we also are one of the world's oldest countries. We're 130 years old. We're the largest insurer in the world, and we're also the world's largest financial services company. Because what people don't realize is when you buy insurance, the money is then invested. And as a result, it's Berkshire Hathaway, the Chinese government, and then Allianz. And so why Oliver is so incredible is he's gone, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to use this to help shape a more resilient future and better societies. And so there are two platforms in particular that we've got a stand on. One is climate change. And Oliver sits on, or actually he chairs the UN Sustainable Development Committee. He's spoken to the UN many times on climate change and business. He's also chaired World Economic Forum discussions on this at Davos, and he's using that position to invest in renewables to help shape future direction. So it's not just lip service, it's actually saying, how do we do something from the core? And then the other one on the flip side is we're also very strongly focused on mental health and community resilience. And so, for example, when we had the dreadful, dreadful bushfires back in December and January, we sat down and said, what can we do for our customers? What can we do for communities? How can we make a difference really in the moments that actually matter and be there for our customers and beyond the expected, just insurance claims? And we realized that we actually had an internal mental health counselling service that we were using for our staff who were speaking to the bushfire victims. And we went, well, actually, why don't we roll these out to our customers? And so then using the purpose, and then you said, how do you make sure you manage it? We actually did risk assessments on it and made sure it was going to work internally, externally. And we made sure it was relevant and meaningful. And we rolled out mental health counselling to our customers and also non-customers. So that's an example for me of a brand that walks the talk in terms of the business strategy and societal change are so closely aligned.
Yeah, so you've illustrated how if a brand gets it right, it can be a great attraction and retention tool, part of the employee value proposition as well as customers. Howard,
it's not right all the time, but it's it's heading towards it.
No one's perfect.
It's knowing, and it's not necessarily even from Allianz. It's just saying more generally, it's knowing it's the right intent and the right direction and getting the right policies, procedures, the route, everything towards that place.
Yeah, there's a bit of work involved. Howard, you've seen some fascinating themes emerging from your research with younger consumers about their expectations of brands and some of the changes there. Could you share some of the key themes of that research with us?
Certainly. Probably the context matters here. So I'll just very briefly share some of the recent research we've done on impact of COVID, which I think gives us a really good context. So we did self-funded research called BCAC World, and effectively we just tried to look at the deeper structural shifts going on in society. The only real outtake that matters here is that COVID has not created any new problems. Outside of the obvious health issues and the likes, but more broadly for brands and marketing, it has exacerbated the existing structural cracks, if you like, in Australian society and really torn them open. And when we look at youth, you see that. So as an example, the number one sign of the times, when we ask people what captures the zeitgeist, is it face masks? Is it hand sanitizer and hoarding toilet roll? No, it's social distancing. 70% of people say it's social distancing is what's most transformed life. As I would put it across. Wearing face masks, only 50% of people thought that. When we look at things like happiness and hope, they're trending down. They're trending consistently down. Fear trending up. And when we look at being disconnected versus being together, and whether as a society we're still an individualistic, atomized, neoliberal, capitalist thing, or whether we're a more social, coming together, respecting each other society, disconnected and together and out the same level, unless you're young. If you're young, you're incredibly disconnected. More than half of young people say they feel disconnected. To contrast that, it's only 29% of people over 65. The line just goes down. The older you get, the less disconnected you feel. The younger you are, the more disconnected. Most young Australians now just feel simply disconnected. If you sum this up, as the data suggests, you basically are facing what we call a youth identity catastrophe. You couldn't buy a house as a young person 2 years ago, let alone last year. You still can't buy a house. You also now can't really get a job. You certainly can't travel. You can't even socialize. You can't meet new people. The very rites of passage that are required to grow up and to find yourself are currently denied to Australians. So we are risking a lost generation, and all the data suggests that this is a fairly significant issue. Now, of course, going into COVID, it was climate change. It was the biggest thing. David Attenborough and various podcasts and the like has been talking about how COVID has just been a disaster for climate change and these more progressive values. And I would suggest that at the moment there is a latent, incredible both anxiety and frustration around this. You know, we've gone from Greta Thunberg being on the front pages to Donald Trump and COVID. And at the same time, nothing's going away. Those structural issues around things like climate change and social inequity are still there. So yeah, it's a colossal job for brands.
Yeah, it's fascinating research, and we all need to be cognizant of it, and brands need to be cognizant of it as they're trying to reach those particularly younger, disconnected consumers. And Leah, you've talked about brands needing license to speak on specific issues. Can you explain a bit what you mean by that and maybe give us an example?
Yeah, sure. I think for me, it goes back to what we were talking about before, and it's about doing and not just saying. As Sophie mentioned, it's not aligning with a particular issue is not just about having that present in your comms material. It needs to be part of your business practices and ideally, in some instances, part of the products that you provide. So Allianz is a really good example of that, the mental health example, where we talked about how we offered mental health services during the bushfires. It's not only present in our comms, but it's present in the product that we offer. Allianz goes beyond insurance, and they offer something of value and something that they deem important to their customers. I think Ben & Jerry's is also a really nice example. So they've got a really long history of speaking out when it comes to racial injustice. Last year, they actually released a new flavour called Justice Remixed, and all of the proceeds for that flavour went to a civil rights group. And what I really like about this example, and actually Allianz as well, is they recognise that they're not experts in this field and when it comes to some of these issues, but they align with people who are experts. So in the case of Ben & Jerry's, they align with NGOs. So yeah, I think that's a really nice space to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, it's a good time to bring in the business lens from the UTS Business School. We've seen new business models emerging out of this new shifting consciousness by consumers and expectations, also by employees. So sometimes that's called conscious commerce. I think that's quite a good term, and businesses are aligning making money with doing good. So can you talk a little bit about that? Do you think that business model is sustainable given that those profit margins might be lower because there's often a component of giving back?
Yes, they would definitely be sustainable. So the way to look at this is first, and Howard's already touched a bit on how consumers, especially the youth today, thinks of brands and thinks of social issues. And there's a lot of studies done by consulting companies, McKinsey, Nielsen, and they've all, the studies generally show that the youth, especially if you look at millennials and Gen Z consumers, they are becoming more and more vocal about social issues, and they want to invest in brands that support these issues. So given that is the future trend, and we know that as a result of that, there are more and more brands coming in that are becoming more vocal about supporting issues. It will become a norm perhaps in the future that all brands have to support these issues, have to, walk the talk. And if you're a brand that's not doing that, you're going to be left behind. So you run that risk of becoming irrelevant in the future. But also given that these younger consumers want brands that they identify with in terms of values and in terms of social issues, you will actually be able to capture a larger share of these consumers. And in the long run, you'll see more volumes, perhaps, even though in the short run, you do see, somewhat of a risk or, somewhat of a cut in your profit or bottom line.
That's interesting. You think it's going to be mainstream? that this will essentially be the standard?
Perhaps. I mean, we've seen how, so companies investing in corporate social responsibility wasn't really a thing 50 or 100 years ago, but now it's been regulated by governments, where brands and businesses have to invest part of their money or profits or revenue into social responsibility. Given that, let's say brands in the future start becoming more and more socially responsible, I think if you're a brand that doesn't do that, then you'll definitely miss the boat.
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely that risk.
Yeah. So, Sophie, how should a marketer who might be at the beginning of this journey or wishing to assist their brand get on the social, the conscious commerce train, how should they choose what to get involved in?
Okay, it's a really interesting one. And I've actually been through this a few times, a few different lives. And I think the most important thing is to understand, first and foremost, what you stand for, what the brand stands for, where your category is at. I think it's really important to understand the social issues facing society, because what you're going to choose to put your emphasis on needs to be something that is going to help actually solve genuine problems that are impacting your customers in particular. Has to come back to the customer and be relevant. Then I think it's really important to go out and research, go and talk to customers from all walks of life, and go and talk to all your different stakeholders. And I was telling the story recently of a focus group I once did out in Orange in rural New South Wales, where we were testing initiatives. And I was sitting on the other side of the wall, and I had to message the researcher and said, is this participant breaking out in a full body rash? Are they actually having an allergic reaction to what I'm proposing we focus on? And the answer was yes. This person literally had an allergic reaction to what we were proposing, because they felt it was so disconnected from the brand and from what they expected from the brand and its role in society. And so when that happens, you go, well, that's not the issue for you to go down. Then really work with the business. So the first side, show the upside of it, show that risk is minimized, show that it is actually going to generate return on investment for the business, get the numbers behind it, and then get your corporate strategy people on board. They need to be the marketer's best friend, because if you've got your brand strategy and your corporate strategy and the initiatives aligned, that's when the magic happens and everything comes together. And then it goes into your board, and that's how you're able to really drive it through an organization. Whereas if it's just a marketing initiative without ROI figures next to it, without customer data, without being seen as actually generating return to the business, at the end of the day, this is the language that the rest of the business speaks. We need to speak it. And you also need to show that you can manage the risks associated with it. You know them, you've documented them, you've mitigated them, you're all over it. Then it becomes a bit more of an easier conversation.
Yeah, that's great advice. And Howard, you teased an answer to this earlier, and one of our audience members has also asked this question. How do we get cynical senior management on side? What are the arguments that marketers can use when they have these conversations internally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to build on the brilliant Sophie's point there. It's about risk. We have an approach at Pollinate called metamorphosis, which looks at those larger transformational structural changes. So we're doing work there, for instance, globally with, is it possible for the world's beef sector to have a sustainability narrative? And if so, what are the implications on beef production? And that's about half of the world's land, half of Australia's land mass, for instance, just generating red meat. And so when you look at those sort of big structural changes, you absolutely have to have the magic alignment, I think you called it. The magic happens when things align, Sophie, and that's exactly it. So when you have cynical senior management, the biggest issue here is you need to align that board level executive decision making with, exactly as Sophie said, consumer values. What matters to them? What are their motivations? Why do they get up in the morning? Why do they choose what's important and what's not important? Well, it's values. Now, that's where we see the disconnect we talked about with brands. Oh, okay, I'm doing this over here, brand. Meanwhile, company over here doing quite the opposite. All right. The biggest thing is risk. When we work with the Great Barrier Reef or dairy industry or forestry, it's actually much more about opportunities and how can we transition. When we're talking to commercial organizations, the for-profit sectors, they actually don't give a shit about values. They almost exclusively don't. They're much more interested in risk. So what we've found working with those clients is frame it, unfortunately, not in a positive narrative, what young people want, but frame it instead for the likely male, stale and pale, cynical senior management. And frankly speaking, that is highly correlated, and you're going to find that. And therefore, you need to talk to them about risk. It is a short-term risk. There's also a long-term risk. There's also a cost and a delay risk. So risk, cost, delay, so reputational risk as well. Yes, of course, there's benefits if we do this, but if you don't, it's actually going to work really well. The other thing to remember, I'd suggest, is it's really worth digging into some of, say, the IPCC work or looking at the reality of communicating issues that are complex dynamic systems. You can't have one message. It just doesn't work. If you look at a lot of the work that's come out of the US or the UK looking at climate change and communications and the contemporary science there, scientists are actually crap at communications. Sorry, Geeta, I know you're amazing at UTS. But the recent papers from the scientists say they need to be working with social scientists and professional communicators and actually understand this. And there's a simple point. Those male, stale and pale, cynical senior managers are probably ideologically on a more right-wing spectrum, not exclusively, but the evidence suggests that. They will only accept a social justice, climate change message if it is framed around economics or patriotism or waste reduction. These are very pragmatic, very ideologically okay things. If, on the other hand, you're talking to a more progressive bunch of senior managers, so not the cynical ones, they're going to accept things like social justice. They're going to look at things like intergenerational equity and longer term payback. The point is, you can't just have one message. That alone is irritating to cynical senior management.
Yes.
Make me an ad. I want one ad. You're like, you can't have one fucking ad, excuse me. It doesn't work. You know, these people don't even see it the same way. It's like the blind man and the elephant. Oh, it's a tree trunk. No, it's a snake. No, they're holding the elephant. They're all right and they're all wrong. And these issues, we need to recognize that we have complicated messaging to do. It's both a nightmare for people like Leah running an agency, but also a huge opportunity. 3 ads, Leah, look at that.
Yeah, so actually to you, Leah, this is a really good point, how it's making. So the marketer is often the interface between the external world and these internal cynical players. So what advice do you give your clients on how do they stay on top of what's changing in the external culture so they can really do a good job of being that conduit to the internal environment?
Sure. I would say leaning on your agency partners and using the tools and the resources that you have at your disposal to keep your finger on the pulse. So at Spark, we use everything at our disposal. So whether that be tools, research, resources that allow cultural fluency and that allow us to understand what's in the hearts and minds of Australia at any given point. Back to Sophie's point earlier, it is so important to understand what your customers or what your audience care about, what the issues are, so that you can find a genuine connection with them.
Yeah. So we've got to wrap up. I want to ask you all one last thing. Your favorite example of a brand that's really got this right. They've really nailed the execution. Geeta, you spoke to us prior, so I want 2 examples from you because you've also got a great example of a brand that didn't get it right, that is now no longer around. So I want you to start, give us the dud, and then give us the one that you love.
Okay, so the brand I mentioned earlier, there was an apparel brand called United Colors of Benetton. They started off by being Benetton. They're still around though, but in a very small scale. They, in the 80s and 90s, they advertised heavily on the platforms of diversity and inclusion, which I think in those days was rare for a brand to do, to stand up for a social cause, but I think it managed to get them a lot of buzz in terms of, just get the brand name out there. But nothing about their product or the corporate policy really aligned with those issues. And so what you see now is, and now that line of advertising is no longer shocking, it's no longer buzzworthy. So they've kind of suffered as a result of that. They're nowhere around. And these new fashion brands have come in with, their sustainable lines and, walking the talk. And so brands that haven't done that have obviously perished.
Yeah. What's your positive example?
So a good example, I think, of a brand that has done this very well. Again, another fashion brand called Tom's, which is a shoe wear brand. And they, when they started out, they kind of based themselves on this foundation of supplying or donating shoes to children in, developing countries or emerging countries. So their philosophy is that for every pair of shoes that they sell to consumers, they will donate a pair to a person in need. And I think that that's a good example of, a social issue done well, and it aligns with the brand's, core philosophy really well.
Nice one. Sophie?
I was thinking about this. I think my favorite one has to be CVS in the US, which is a pharmacy brand. And they were selling tobacco like all pharmacies in the US, which is a bit of a contradiction. And their purpose was around health and well-being. And they realized that they were at odds to what they stood for as an organization. And so they took a huge financial hit and they pulled all the cigarettes off their shelves and, strongly communicated why they did it, why they were breaking up with the tobacco companies. And really, I think that, it's true to who they were and their customers. And I think that was very admirable. But in the end, will be better for them as an organization because, they're not, sitting there supporting lung cancer patients on one hand and, selling tobacco on the other. And so actually, it's a much better move for the organization.
Brilliant. Howard?
Sorry, just unmuting. I've probably got two. One of them is Patagonia because it's a bit famous. But the founder of Patagonia, of course, was someone who climbs mountains and does a lot of outdoor stuff, Patagonia, and has literally woven that philosophy of maintaining the natural system and protecting it into everything they do. I mean, these guys invented materials made out of recycled PET way before this was happening in the mainstream. And if you go into a Patagonia store, there's literature promoting conservation issues, whether it's a forestry issue or whatever it might be. So everything that company does will absolutely not move away from its founding principles. So that's crucial. They don't have the sort of tensions we've been discussing here, because they simply wouldn't do something that goes against their values. They don't have to worry about their brand and their alignment and the magic happening with alignment. They'd actually just look at everybody else and go, well, you're just lying. That's the point. Most companies and organizations and governments, frankly, are part of the problem. And Patagonia, from the beginning, has says, we are going to be part of the solution in everything we do. And there's no compromise. They're 100%. And with the greatest respect to Sophie, the Allianz, my other example is Australian Ethical, because they have no compromise either. We disclaimer here, we work with Australian Ethical, have done for years. They're now just over 4 billion funds under management. I just checked that. When we first started working with them, their goal was to be 1 billion. They are pathologically focused on only doing no harm through their investments. And they constantly review everything. They have a zero tolerance. They're pretty much fossil fuel free in every single way, to the extent that they go, should we support a pipeline company that makes pipelines? Because those pipelines could be used for oil transport. They could also be used for water. But they're like, but if they can't guarantee that their pipes aren't also used for oil and gas, then we shouldn't invest in them. So that's the degree of ethical consideration given there. Hugely successful. And what they've really demonstrated is it's quite possible to create ongoing, enduring success from having ethical investments. So I think they're examples where a values-based organization not just drives success and leadership in their category, but also has an enduring impact on the whole category, everybody else. And finally, they don't have these issues.
Yeah. Leah, what's your favorite example?
I'll keep it really quick. I would say Tom's was actually one of my favorites as well. Another one would be Who Gives a Crap? And I think actually, Geeta, you mentioned this to us earlier. And like Tom's, I really like this example because social good is part of the fabric of that company, of that organization. It's actually, it's part of its purpose and it's why it was created. So I think that is a really nice example of doing it well. And they're a for-profit business as well. So whilst they give back to the community, they're still a for-profit business, and it works.
Yeah, absolutely. So Leah Robinson from Spark Foundry, Howard Parry Husbands from Pollinate, Geeta Saluja from UTS Business School, and Sophie Finn from Allianz. Thank you so much for enlightening us today about conscious commerce. I'm going to hand back to Gay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I just want to go out to lunch with you all now and chat more about this, but thank you for your time.
I'm free for lunch.
Yeah, okay, Howard, I'll get back to you.